The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in June before Marcus Chen had finished his first cup of coffee. Subject line, pool usage violation, citation pending. He read it twice, certain he'd misunderstood. His neighbor, Patricia Hendricks, known throughout Oakmont Estates as Karen by everyone except those forced to address her by name, had reported him for unauthorized pool maintenance. Not that Marcus had a pool. He lived in a 1970s ranch house with a cracked driveway and gutters that needed cleaning. His backyard was a rectangle of patchy grass surrounded by a wooden fence that had seen better decades. The citation was detailed: excessive water usage, suspicious late-night activity, equipment being transported through shared boundary lines. Marcus stared at his water bill from the previous month. It had tripled. He called the water company. After 20 minutes of phone trees and hold music, a tired representative confirmed it, an unprecedented spike, concentrated in the evening hours. They suggested a leak. Marcus walked his property with a flashlight and found nothing. No puddles, no soft ground, no telltale hissing of escaping water. He stood at the fence line separating his property from Patricia's and looked through a gap in the boards. Beyond her perfectly manicured lawn sat a resort-style pool that had been installed 3 months earlier. Sparkling, ostentatious, probably 15,000 gallons. Marcus had attended the HOA meeting when Patricia proposed it. He'd said nothing, but he'd thought plenty. The community had rules about pool size, fence height, lawn fertilizer, rules that Patricia had helped write. Yet somehow her pool had been approved with an expedited variance that made other residents' eyebrows climb. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife, Diane. "Did you get the thing from HOA? I heard Patricia filed like 5 complaints about your yard." They'd been divorced for 2 years, but Diane still lived 3 streets over and remained connected to the community's gossip network like a neural implant. Marcus loved that she was still looking out for him, though he hated that she had to. He called the HOA office. The director, Stephen Marks, answered on the 3rd ring. They'd gone to high school together, though Stephen had been the type to volunteer for hall monitor duty, and Marcus had been the type to skip study hall. "Hey, Marcus, yeah, I saw Patricia's complaint. She's filed 3 this week, actually, the tall grass thing, the unsightly storage, and now the water usage." "Stephen, my grass is fine, and I don't have any storage in my yard." "I know, buddy. Look, between you and me, Patricia's a problem, but she pays her HOA fees on time, donates to the community fund, and her husband's some kind of venture capitalist. The board, they listen to people like that." Stephen's voice dropped. "Just maybe edge your lawn and move whatever she's talking about before she escalates." "There is nothing to move." A pause. "Then why is your water bill so high?" Marcus didn't have an answer, not yet. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch with a beer and watched the sun bleed orange across the sky. His phone sat on the arm of the chair, Patricia's email still open on the screen. Citation pending, as if he'd committed a crime. He knew her story the way everyone in Oakmont Estates knew it. Patricia had grown up here, moved away for college and a marriage to Gregory Hendricks, who'd made money in some kind of tech startup that got acquired. They'd moved back to Oakmont 5 years ago with the kind of wealth that made normal life feel like a costume they were trying on. 2 kids, a Range Rover, a membership to the country club. Patricia had thrown herself into community, organizing with the zeal of someone who'd finally found an arena where her voice mattered. The HOA rules had tightened dramatically after she joined the board. Fence colors, driveway materials, the number of decorative planters allowed on front porches. She'd positioned herself as the guardian of property values, which really meant the guardian of the aesthetic her taste required. Marcus's house didn't fit the aesthetic. It was too old, too modest, too obviously owned by someone who'd lived there for 15 years and was comfortable with a few imperfections. The kind of house that reminded people like Patricia where they'd come from, and they hated that. The water bill was deliberate. He was certain of it. A push to make his life difficult enough that he'd either pay an exorbitant fee to fix a problem that wasn't his, or fail some HOA inspection and face fines. His phone rang, unknown number. "Mr. Chen?" A woman's voice, professional and careful. "This is Detective Sarah Walsh with the Municipal Water Fraud Division. We've been reviewing unusual consumption patterns in your area, and I'd like to set up a time to inspect your property." "Water fraud?" Marcus's stomach did a slow roll. "What does that mean?" It means someone in your immediate vicinity is stealing water. Could be siphoning, could be an illegal tap into the main line, could be something else. We need to document everything. Are you home this Thursday? Thursday came hot and humid. Detective Walsh was in her 50s, with iron gray hair pulled into a no-nonsense braid and the practical demeanor of someone who'd seen too many creative ways people found to solve small problems by creating larger ones. She arrived with a county water technician named Deshawn, who carried equipment that looked more suited to bomb detection than plumbing. They swept Marcus's property methodically. Under the house, through the basement, a dank space that smelled of earth and old concrete, and into the backyard where they ran sensors across the grass. "You've got an old foundation," Deshawn observed, squatting near the back corner of the house. "Really old, looks like it was built on top of something else." Walsh crouched beside him. "What do you mean, on top of something?" "There's a drop-off here, here's your foundation, and then about 2 feet down there's another layer. Could be an old cellar system. A lot of pre-1920s properties had them." Marcus had owned the house for 15 years and had never noticed. "Can you tell what it is?" Deshawn pulled out a ground-penetrating radar device and spent 10 minutes scanning the area. When he stood up, his expression had shifted from casual interest to something sharper. "Detective, you're going to want to see this." What the radar revealed made even Walsh pause. Beneath the backyard, extending toward Patricia's property, was a void. Not a natural one, a tunnel-shaped void, approximately 8 feet wide, sloping downward at a 45-degree angle. "That's not right," Walsh muttered. "How old did you say this house was?" "Built in 1978, Marcus said. "The neighborhood was a development. All the houses went up around the same time." "Then what's a tunnel from the 1800s doing under your yard?" Deshawn looked at Marcus directly. "You ever hear anything strange down here? Voices, movement, vibrations?" "No, nothing." Marcus's mouth had gone dry. "What's it for?" Walsh exchanged a look with Deshawn, the kind of look that suggested they'd found something that required the conversation to move to a different level. "Mr. Chen, do you know the history of Oakmont Estates? What was here before the development?" "Not really. It used to be farmland, I think. My realtor mentioned something about an old plantation from the 1800s, but the house was gone before any of us moved here." Walsh nodded slowly. "I need to contact the County Historical Society. In the meantime, I'm asking you not to disturb this area, and I'd like to know everyone who's been in your backyard in the last 6 months." One name came to mind immediately: Patricia Hendricks. Her pool contractor had been here twice. Work crews, surveying, Patricia herself walking the property line with her architect, discussing aesthetics. The following Monday, Marcus received another email. The citation had been upgraded. An investigation was being opened into possible water theft. The fine structure had changed. Suddenly, Patricia's accusations carried weight, not because she was right, but because the existence of the tunnel created ambiguity, and ambiguity gave her ammunition. He called Diane. "This is insane," she said, and he could hear the click of her keyboard as she opened the email he'd forwarded. "Marcus, she's clearly stealing your water. Why would she report you if she wasn't trying to cover her tracks?" The detective said the tunnel might be part of it, but they don't know yet. And now the HOA's using it against me like I'm the one doing something wrong. "Because that's what Karen does." Diane had adopted the nickname with the fervor of someone who'd watched Marcus go through years of this. "She creates a problem, points at someone else, and leaves you standing there covered in the mud." "What can I do?" "Hire a lawyer, document everything, and Marcus, start digging, literally. If there's a tunnel under your house that connects to her pool, that's proof. You need evidence." After they hung up, Marcus stood in his backyard and stared at the grass. Somewhere beneath it was the answer. Somewhere beneath the carefully maintained lawn and the fence and the HOA regulations was a piece of history that had been buried, and then built over, and then buried again. Marcus started digging on a Friday evening when the sun was low, and the neighbors were inside having dinner. He'd marked the area where Deshawn's radar indicated the tunnel was closest to the surface, about 30 feet from the house, nestled behind the ancient oak tree that had been there longer than any of the subdivision. The first 3 feet came out easily enough. Red clay and rocks, compacted over decades. His shoulders burned and his hands developed blisters, but there was something meditative about the repetitive motion. Each shovelful felt like reclaiming something that had been taken. At 4 feet, the shovel struck something solid, not stone, wood. Marcus cleared away the dirt carefully, and the shape of something emerged, curved and thick, aged gray. The top of what looked like a tunnel entrance, or more accurately, the roof of something that had once been accessible. He worked for another hour, uncovering enough to see it was a timber frame, reinforced with metal banding. Hand-forged iron, the kind that hadn't been made since before the Civil War. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging, this isn't your business." Marcus stared at it for 30 seconds, then called Detective Walsh. "It's a threat," he said. "Someone knows what I found." "Can you determine who sent it?" "No, it's a burner number, but there's only a few people who know I've been excavating." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Chen, I need to be direct with you. The tunnel appears to be a pre-Civil War structure. We've contacted the Historical Society, and they have records of an underground railroad station that operated on or near your property. It's a significant discovery." Marcus sat down on the edge of the excavation pit. An underground railroad station. His house, his modest, ordinary 1970s house, was built on top of a part of American history he'd never known existed. "There's something else," Walsh continued. "The water theft we detected isn't new. The consumption pattern shows consistent usage going back at least 6 months. Whoever's doing it has been very methodical, and I've checked the records. Patricia Hendricks' pool was installed 4 months ago." The timeline clicked into place. Patricia had started planning the pool. Her architects and contractors would have surveyed the land. During that survey, they might have found the tunnel entrance on the property line. And then they'd needed water, lots of water. A tunnel that connected 2 properties could provide access to. "She's tapped into an old water line," Marcus said. "Something connected to the tunnel structure." "That's what we think, but we're going to need more than suspicion. We need documentation. If you can access the tunnel, photograph everything. But Mr. Chen, do this carefully. If we're right about what this is, there could be artifacts, historical significance." After they hung up, Marcus looked back at the hole he'd created. The wooden roof of the tunnel was still mostly buried, but he could see the seams now. His fingers traced the old timber. How many people had stood in this exact spot 150 years ago, moving through darkness toward freedom? He covered the hole loosely with a tarp, left the shovel leaning against the oak tree, and went inside. Saturday morning, Marcus woke to find 3 new notices on his mailbox. The first was from the HOA, declaring his unauthorized excavation a violation of community standards. Fines would accrue daily until the hole was filled. The second was from the county water department, indicating that further investigation into the tunnel was required before usage violations could be determined. The third was handwritten, on expensive cardstock. "Marcus, I'm sure you understand this is a delicate situation. I've invested significantly in Oakmont Estates, and I won't have my property values disrupted by historical tourism. I'm willing to pay for your silence regarding the tunnel. $50,000 should suffice. It's a generous offer considering what I could make happen with the HOA board. Patricia." He read it 3 times, trying to parse whether it was blackmail or a bribe or some hybrid of both. He photographed it, then called Detective Walsh. "This is a confession," Walsh said immediately. "She's admitting knowledge of the tunnel and attempting to suppress evidence of a historical site. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge it. Just keep it safe." By Monday, word had spread through Oakmont Estates. Everyone knew there was a tunnel. Most people also knew that Patricia was involved. The theory had evolved beyond theft. People were whispering about what she might be hiding, why she'd be so desperate to keep it secret, what she might be covering up. The HOA meeting that Tuesday night was packed. Stephen Marks looked uncomfortable presiding over it, aware that his high school friend and one of the community's most generous donors had put him in an impossible position. Patricia sat in the 3rd row, her jaw clenched, her Range Rover keychain spinning between her fingers in tight, agitated circles. Her husband, Gregory, sat beside her with the expression of a man watching his financial portfolio crater in real time. Stephen opened the meeting by reading prepared statements about respecting historical sites and following appropriate channels for archaeological work. He was clearly trying to thread a needle, not taking sides, keeping everything procedural. Then someone raised their hand. Has anyone considered that if Patricia's been stealing water, the rest of our bills might be getting jacked up to cover it? It was Robert Chen, no relation to Marcus, from 2 streets over. I've got a family of 4, and my bill's been up 40% in 6 months. Other hands shot up, other stories, other bills that had risen inexplicably. Marcus watched Patricia's face go white, then red. Stephen banged his gavel. We're going to let the county handle this investigation. In the meantime, any residents with concerns about their water bills can file a formal complaint. Patricia stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. That tunnel has nothing to do with anything. A few people got greedy with their usage, and now everyone wants to blame me. The county found a direct connection between your property and the water theft, Stephen said carefully, reading from his notes. The preliminary report indicates. I don't care what it indicates. I want that tunnel filled. I want it forgotten. I want this whole thing to go away. Patricia's voice had taken on a shrill edge. My family moved back here to be part of this community. We've supported it financially. We've made it better. And now I'm being treated like a criminal because some paranoid neighbor couldn't mind his own business. She looked directly at Marcus. In her eyes was something that transcended anger. It was the fury of someone who was accustomed to controlling every narrative, winning every conflict, and was now watching that power slip away. You're making a huge mistake, she said to Marcus. You have no idea what you've started. The room fell silent. Gregory grabbed Patricia's arm. She pulled away, gathered her purse, and left, her heels clicking against the tile floor with sharp, furious precision. Stephen cleared his throat, moving on to new business. But everyone was watching Marcus now, some with sympathy, some with caution. He'd started something, whether it was the right thing or not remained to be seen. Wednesday morning, Marcus returned to the excavation. The tarp had been torn away. The shovel was gone. But worse, the hole had been partly filled in with concrete. Someone had come in the night and poured a quick-setting mix over the tunnel opening, partially sealing it. He called Detective Walsh immediately. Destruction of evidence, she said. That's another charge. We're moving faster now. I'm getting a warrant to excavate properly. And Marcus, we found something in the property records. The old tunnel system wasn't just railroad. There's documentation of a separate structure built on the property in 1886 by one of the original families. A house that burned down. People died in that fire. People? 3 people listed as servants. That's all the record says. But there's a discrepancy in the official death toll versus what the county coroner actually reported. Someone altered the documentation. The County Historical Society is looking into it. Marcus stared at the scarred earth where the tunnel mouth had been. Somewhere beneath his house, beneath all this modern construction and HOA regulations and suburban normalcy, was a grave. Not metaphorical. Real. By Thursday, the county had arrived with heavy equipment and a team of archaeologists led by Dr. Margaret Simmons, a woman in her 60s with the careful intensity of someone who'd spent her career pulling truth out of the earth. They worked in a grid pattern, removing the concrete, documenting everything. Patricia and Gregory watched from their yard, standing near the pool, that pristine blue pool that had started all of this. By day 2, they'd uncovered the tunnel entrance fully. It was remarkable, a solid timber construction with hand-cut wooden joints, the wood still intact despite nearly 2 centuries of burial. There were markings inside the tunnel wall, initials carved into the wood, dates, what looked like a prayer in careful handwriting. Dr. Simmons found the first bone on day 3, small, easily missed, a vertebra delicate as a bird's wing. Then more, an entire skeleton, arranged carefully in the section of tunnel nearest Patricia's property, beneath the pool foundation. And then in the earth just inside the tunnel entrance, a wedding ring. Victorian era marked on the inside with initials, EM and JH 1859. Dr. Simmons held it up, her gloved hands trembling slightly. This person wanted to be remembered, she said. They wore this right up until they were placed here. The police descended on Patricia's property within an hour. They excavated around the pool, and what they found was systematic. A shallow grave, disturbed several times over the years, probably during pool construction when new concrete was being poured, but never fully investigated, because no one knew to look. The bones were partial but diagnostic. Female, possibly in her 30s at time of death. Trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force. and in the grave with her, remnants of a dress that carbon dated to the 1880s. And beneath the skeleton, scratched into the soil itself, a message carved with something sharp. She would not stay in the tunnel. They found her here. They buried her quick. J. Patricia was arrested on a Wednesday afternoon. The charges were complex: obstruction of historical investigation, destruction of evidence, theft of water. But the undercurrent was darker. The remains of a woman, possibly enslaved or indentured, who died in what looked increasingly like a murder. And Patricia, in trying to hide the tunnel, had disturbed a grave that might never have been properly acknowledged otherwise. The news reached the national level. HOA president arrests in connection with Civil War-era tunnel discovery. The media descended on Oakmont Estates. News vans lined the streets. National news personalities stood in front of the excavation site talking about forgotten history and the long shadow of America's past. Marcus stopped leaving his house. His phone rang constantly with interview requests. The HOA issued a statement of concern. The county expanded the excavation across both properties, discovering that the tunnel system was far more extensive than anyone had realized. And then Dr. Simmons made the discovery that changed everything. In the deeper reaches of the tunnel, past where the main branch forked, in a chamber that had been sealed and then resealed over time, they found a ledger. Water-damaged but legible. Names, dates, destinations. It was a record, an official, meticulous record of the Underground Railroad stop that had operated at this location from 1859 to 1865. How many people had passed through, where they'd been sent? How many had made it to Canada? How many had been turned back by slave catchers and what had happened to them? And scattered throughout the ledger in what appeared to be a different handwriting, desperate, urgent notes about who refused to go further, who wanted to stay, who they could not control. The skeleton was identified through dental records and historical databases as Emily Marsh, born 1843. She'd been listed in a plantation ledger in Georgia as indentured servant, sold at 18 to a family in North Carolina. At some point in 1883, she'd disappeared from the records. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd made it to the tunnel. The archaeological team, now expanded to 15 people, worked systematically through the site. Marcus's house became a research station. Teams of forensic anthropologists, historians, and DNA specialists worked to piece together Emily's story. What they found was partial and haunting. Emily had likely been part of a group passing through the tunnel system decades after the Civil War ended. She was free technically, but the South hadn't let go of the idea that certain people could be reclaimed, resold, controlled. She'd made it as far as the tunnel, and then something had happened. The forensic evidence suggested she'd been killed in the tunnel and then moved to the secondary grave. The skull fracture indicated blunt force trauma. But what struck everyone, historians, police, forensic specialists, was the wedding ring and the ledger notes. She was trying to stay, Dr. Simmons explained at a formal presentation to the county board. The notes suggest that Emily fell in love with someone, possibly another fugitive or someone operating the station. When the decision was made that the group had to move on, she refused. Someone killed her for it. Or, Simmons paused, careful, someone killed her to prevent her from being captured and returned to slavery. It's possible this was an act of mercy by someone involved in the station operations. The trauma is consistent with both possibilities. The discovery made international news. Emily became a name instead of a statistic. The tunnel became a pilgrimage site. Historians found references to her in Underground Railroad records that had been interpreted as cryptic for over a century. Now they read like elegies. And Patricia Hendricks became the face of a different kind of violence, the erasure of history, the destruction of evidence to preserve property values. Her pool, now surrounded by police tape and archaeological markers, became a symbol, not of wealth or taste, of the way the present could literally cover up the past. She was released on bail pending trial. The charges had expanded to include destruction of cultural property, but the real damage was social. Within 2 weeks, Patricia had lost her position on every board she served. The country club membership was quietly suspended. Friends stopped answering her calls. Gregory was photographed leaving their house with a suitcase. The internet's amateur detectives ran with theories. There were whispers about divorce, about separate lawyers, about Patricia's spending habits and Gregory's new concerns. The truth, likely, was simpler and sadder. Gregory had decided his wife wasn't worth the association. On a Saturday morning, Marcus received a call from Patricia's lawyer. She wanted to meet, alone, at the house. He almost didn't go, but he did because understanding why she'd done it mattered somehow. Understanding how someone became so committed to controlling their world that they'd destroy history rather than acknowledge it. Patricia opened the door herself. She looked smaller than he remembered. The expensive clothing hung loose. She'd lost weight or simply lost the energy to maintain the appearance. Her hair, usually immaculate, was pulled back in a careless ponytail. "Thank you for coming," she said. They stood in her pristine living room where nothing appeared out of place except Patricia herself. She gestured to a chair, and Marcus sat, hyper-aware of how formal the gesture felt, how much it felt like a negotiation. "I want you to understand," Patricia began, "that I didn't know. When I hired the contractors, I didn't know there was a tunnel under the property line. I didn't know anything was there." "But you found out?" "Yes, during the pool excavation. The foreman mentioned they'd hit something, an old structure. He said the foundation was unusual, that there seemed to be something beneath the property. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought it was nothing, some old cellar or Native American thing. I told him to concrete over it and keep going. It would be simpler than dealing with preservation groups and delays." "That was the connection to my property." "Yes, the foreman said the structure extended across the line. He said we could either excavate properly or just seal it and move on. I chose to seal it." She looked at Marcus directly. "And then the water bill." Patricia nodded slowly. "The concrete broke. Water from the tunnel system was entering our pool. It saved us thousands in circulation costs because the tunnel maintained a consistent level of underground water. It was," she paused, searching for the word, "convenient." "You knew someone was noticing." "I suspected. When the county called, I panicked. I hired an engineer to look at it. He's the one who actually found the tap in the old pipe system. He told me it had been there for decades, probably installed by whoever the property belonged to before the subdivision. I thought, if I didn't draw attention to it, if I made sure you looked suspicious instead." Patricia's voice trailed off. "I thought the investigation would go away." "And then you found the bones." She closed her eyes. "The contractors found them during the initial pool work. They called me at the site. I saw—" She stopped. "I saw bones in the earth, and they said if we reported it, if we stopped work and called the authorities, the property could be tied up for months, years maybe. The pool would never be finished. The project would be halted. The whole thing would become complicated." "So you buried her again?" "I didn't think about who she was." Patricia's voice rose, and for the first time, Marcus saw something other than careful control. He saw fear. "I didn't think about her as a person. I thought about concrete and timelines and costs. I wanted the pool. I wanted it finished. I wanted my life to proceed exactly as planned, and bones were in the way." She stood abruptly, walked to the window where Marcus could see the excavation site beyond the fence. The tarped sections, the markers, the flags and grids indicating where history was being carefully extracted from the earth. "That's the thing about being someone like me," Patricia continued quietly. "You spend so much time managing appearances and impressions and timelines that real things become invisible. A skeleton is just a problem. History is just an obstacle. A person who lived and loved and wanted things is just inconvenient." "You tried to intimidate me into stopping." "Yes." "You tried to pay me to keep quiet." "Yes." "And when that didn't work—" Patricia turned back to face him. "When that didn't work, I tried to destroy the evidence before anyone could figure out what it meant. I poured concrete over the entrance. I told people the tunnel was meaningless, probably just old drain systems. I was trying to preserve the narrative where none of this was real." "Why tell me this now?" She sat back down heavily, as if the weight of the admission had become too much to stand under. "Because I have a lawyer who says I should stay silent, that I shouldn't explain myself or admit anything, that my testimony could be used against me, and he's right. Legally, he's absolutely right." Patricia picked at a thread on her sleeve. "But I need someone to know that I understood finally what I'd done. When I saw her name, Emily Marsh, when I learned she was a real person who had loved someone enough to die for it, I understood. And I hate that it took all of this." She looked at Marcus with red-rimmed eyes. "I hate that I had to be arrested and humiliated and destroyed professionally for it to finally penetrate my skull that history isn't just something that happens to other people. That bones in the ground are people who wanted things, who had choices, who mattered." The room was very quiet. "That doesn't make it okay," Marcus said. No, Patricia agreed. It doesn't, but I needed someone to know that I know that. After Marcus left, he stood in his own backyard for a long time looking at the excavation. Workers were carefully removing soil from the chamber where Emily had been found. Each shovelful was documented, photographed, analyzed. She was being given the dignity of an archaeology, of recognition. His phone rang. Diane. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm okay. Patricia just wanted me to understand her reasoning." "And did you understand it?" "Yes, that's the problem. I understood it perfectly, and that's almost worse than if I didn't." Diane was quiet for a moment. That's what happens when you take time to really look at people. They stop being villains and start being complicated. It's less satisfying. It's a lot less satisfying. Are you going to press charges? Additional charges, I mean, beyond what the county's doing? I don't know yet. Dr. Simmons approached Marcus the next morning as he watched the excavation from his porch. "We've identified several more individuals from the ledger who passed through this station," she said, settling beside him with coffee she'd brought from the site. 6 confirmed arrivals in Canada with records matching. 2 who made it to Ohio and disappear from records there, possible sign of new identities. 4 whose fate remains unknown, but who are referenced in ledger notes as successful passage. And Emily. Emily is unique. She's the only one with physical remains we've found. The others, if they died, were buried elsewhere or their remains weren't preserved in the historical record. Simmons sipped her coffee. "We've been able to identify the man she loved, we think. Name was Joshua Harris. There are multiple references to J in the notes. Joshua made it to Canada and established a life there, married someone else, had children. His descendants still live in Toronto." She pulled out a photograph from her jacket, a daguerreotype, faded but clear. A man in his 20s, formal and solemn, the way everyone looked in old photographs. "That's Joshua," Simmons said. And beneath the ledger entry for his name, someone, likely the station operator, wrote, "He loved her. He would have stayed, but love is sometimes leaving." Marcus looked at Joshua's face, frozen in time 150 years ago, unaware that the woman he'd loved would still be in the earth centuries later, wearing his wedding ring. Part 4, The Trial. The trial of Patricia Hendricks began in October, 3 months after Emily's remains were discovered. The media had built a narrative, not of a wealthy woman who'd made a terrible decision, but of the persistent way that history was erased by the present, how capitalism and property ownership could literally bury the past. Marcus was called as the first witness. He described finding the tunnel, the escalating threats, the concrete poured in the night. His testimony was straightforward and devastating. Patricia's lawyer tried to undermine him. "Isn't it true that you were motivated by financial concerns, that your water bill was the actual catalyst for the excavation?" "Yes," Marcus admitted, "but that doesn't change what was underneath." The prosecutor called forensic specialists, historians, and experts who detailed the systematic destruction of evidence. They called Gregory Hendricks, who testified that his wife had explicitly ordered the destruction of the tunnel entrance, calling it an inconvenience to the development. Patricia took the stand on the 4th day. She was composed but fragile, like something that might shatter if the wrong word was applied. Her lawyer had prepped her carefully, but preparation could only go so far. The prosecutor asked her to walk through her reasoning step by step. "Why did you order the tunnel sealed?" "Because I didn't want delays." "Why didn't you report the bones when you found them?" "Because I didn't understand the significance." "Do you understand it now?" "Yes." And then the prosecutor asked the question that changed something in the courtroom. "Ms. Hendricks, if you could go back, knowing what you know now about Emily Marsh, would you have done anything differently?" Patricia's jaw clenched. She looked at the jury, then at the section where relatives of the county and historical society were seated, then down at her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I mean, yes, obviously yes, but that's not the real question, is it? The real question is what I would have done in that moment with the knowledge I actually had, and honestly," she looked directly at the jury. "I don't know, I want to say I would have done the right thing, but I can't promise that. I was the kind of person who valued her pool more than history. I might still be that person, now I know what kind of person that is." Her lawyer looked like he wanted to die. The prosecutor rested his case. The verdict came back in 6 hours. Guilty on destruction of cultural property, obstruction of investigation, and water theft. The additional charges related to intimidation were dismissed on a technicality. Patricia was sentenced to 18 months in minimum security federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to the county's historical preservation fund. She was also permanently removed from any position on the HOA board. As she was led away after sentencing, she looked directly at Marcus, not with anger or accusation, but with something closer to resignation, like she'd finally understood that some things, once broken, couldn't be mended by anything except time, and maybe not even then. Gregory filed for divorce while she was in prison. He'd already started a relationship with a woman in his firm. The house in Oakmont went on the market at a loss. In the months that followed, Marcus's house became increasingly famous, not in a way he'd wanted. The story had settled into the culture as a kind of parable, about how the past inevitably resurfaces, about the ways that carelessness erases history, about the woman in the tunnel who'd loved someone and refused to run. Tour groups asked permission to view the excavation. The county established a preservation site. A small museum was planned in the village square dedicated to the Underground Railroad network that had operated across 3 counties. Emily Marsh, previously unknown and unmourned for over a century, became the face of that network. And Marcus became the man who'd uncovered her. He hadn't wanted it, but he'd started digging, and once you start, you can't stop until you've reached something solid. On a cool afternoon in November, Marcus stood in his backyard beside Dr. Simmons. The excavation had been completed and carefully documented. The bones had been given a proper burial in a cemetery dedicated to Underground Railroad operators and fugitives. The tunnel had been stabilized and prepared for limited public access. "We found something else," Simmons said, handing him a small burlap bag. Inside was a leather journal, rotted and fragile but legible. "It was buried with Emily. We believe it belonged to her or possibly to Joshua. We're still working on authentication, but I wanted you to see it first." Marcus opened it carefully. The handwriting was small and precise, in pencil that had faded but survived. "If I do not see Canada, I will not see sorrow. If I stop here, I will have lived long enough to know what it means to be wanted by someone who matters. That is enough. Tell Joshua if you can find him, tell him that I wore his ring as a bride wears flowers on her wedding day, not knowing when the ceremony would end. I am grateful. I am ready. The tunnel was not the destination. He was." There was no date, just that. A final message from a woman who'd chosen to stay. "We think," Simmons said quietly, "that she may have killed herself rather than run further, or allowed someone to kill her. A mercy, perhaps. The forensic evidence isn't conclusive about the timing or the exact cause, but the note suggests choice." Marcus read it again and again. He was the destination. Winter came early that year. The excavation site was mothballed until spring, sealed against weather and casual intrusion. Marcus received an HOA notice that his property was now eligible for a property tax exemption due to its historical significance. They were also offering to reimburse his legal fees from the dispute. It was a gesture that felt inadequate and insincere, like Stephen Marks trying to atone for the fact that the organization he ran had enabled Patricia's actions by never questioning her authority. Marcus declined the money. He didn't need it. He'd received settlement offers from both the county and from Gregory Hendrick's lawyers, money that felt like it was meant to buy his silence retroactively. He donated all of it to the Historical Preservation Fund. In January, a year after the original discovery, Marcus received a letter from Toronto. It was from Margaret Simmons on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution and the Joshua Harris Foundation, an organization started by descendants of Joshua Harris who'd recently learned the full story of the man their ancestors had known only as the ancestor who came from the South. Joshua, it turned out, had been memorialized by his family, but the details of his life had been lost to time. His daughter had married, his grandchildren had assimilated, his great-grandchildren had American lives that moved further and further from his origins. But somewhere in the family memory was the story that Joshua had loved someone who'd stayed behind, that he'd written letters that never reached her, that he'd lived with an absence that shaped his entire life in subtle ways. The foundation had created a scholarship in Emily Marsh's name. It funded historical research about women in the Underground Railroad, about choices made in impossible circumstances, about the people who'd remained behind by choice or circumstance or coercion. Would Marcus be willing to serve on the advisory board? He said yes. In March, Marcus ran into Patricia at the grocery store. She was out on parole, awaiting final sentencing modifications. She looked different, smaller, yes, but also somehow more present. Like she'd finally decided to inhabit her actual life instead of the life she'd been curating. They stood near the produce section, holding packages of vegetables, uncertainty passing between them like a physical thing. "Hello, Marcus," she said finally. "Patricia, I wanted to apologize in person, not because my lawyer advised me not to, but because I needed you to know that I meant it. I know. The Historical Society is doing remarkable work with Emily's story. Have you seen the exhibit?" I went to the opening. They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the mundane commerce of grocery shopping continued. People moved past them unseeing. "I'm leaving Oakmont," Patricia said. "Gregory and I are divorcing. The house is sold. I'm going back to school, actually, to study history and cultural preservation. I know it's—" She paused. "It's probably too little too late. I know I can't undo anything, but I wanted to do something, so I'm doing what I can." "That's good," Marcus said, and found that he meant it. Patricia nodded, and then, because there was nothing else to say, she completed her shopping and left. Marcus stood there for a long time after, holding his vegetables, thinking about beginnings and endings, about the way crisis could sometimes crack open a person in such a way that something like growth became possible. The second winter after the discovery came cold and heavy. Marcus had become something unexpected in Oakmont Estates, not a pariah but a kind of local institution. The man who'd dug up history, the man who'd exposed the tunnel. There was respect now where there had been suspicion before. There was also a persistent, low-grade pressure from people who wanted him to comment on neighborhood issues, who assumed his discovery of Emily's grave meant he possessed some unique insight into truth and justice. He didn't, he'd simply started digging. But he'd learned something in the process, that the ground beneath you is never empty, that history isn't something that happens to other people in other times, that Patricia had been right about one thing. It was easier to treat the bones as an inconvenience than to understand them as evidence of a person who'd lived and wanted and loved. His water bill had normalized. The HOA had tightened its rules around excavation and property modification, though not in ways that would have prevented the original tunnel from being discovered. There was no rule that could prevent the past from surfacing. One evening in November, exactly 2 years after the first email, Marcus received a visitor. It was Dr. Simmons, and she was holding something wrapped carefully in acid-free paper. "We're returning this to you," she said. "The wedding ring, we've completed all the forensic analysis we can. There's no need to keep it as evidence anymore." She unwrapped it carefully. The Victorian gold caught the light. Inside, the initials were still visible, EM and JH 1859. "We tried to track down Joshua's descendants more thoroughly," Simmons continued. "They didn't want possession of it. They said it belonged with Emily and Emily belonged here. They wanted you to have it, as the person who found her, as the person who decided that she mattered." Marcus held the ring, feeling its slight weight, its age, the ghost of the hand that had worn it. "What are you going to do with it?" Simmons asked. "I don't know yet. Maybe the museum." "Maybe," Simmons agreed. "Or maybe something else will feel right when you figure out what that is." Spring came again, and with it, the official dedication of the Emily Marsh Memorial Park. The county had converted the excavation site into a small, dignified space where the tunnel entrance was preserved beneath a protective structure. Markers explained the historical significance. Information about the Underground Railroad was presented sensitively and thoroughly. The dedication was attended by county officials, historians, descendants of Joshua Harris, teachers and students, and hundreds of people who'd heard Emily's story and felt called to bear witness to her memory. Marcus stood at the entrance to the preserved tunnel, looking down into the darkness where Emily had been found. The bones had been reburied 3 months earlier with a full funeral service, presided over by a minister who worked in the county's Department of Historical Reconciliation. It was a ceremony for a woman no one had remembered to mourn for over 100 years. Gregory Hendricks was there. He donated money to the memorial fund as part of his divorce settlement, his way of trying to wash his hands of the guilt of association, Marcus supposed. Patricia did not attend. She was in Georgia, attending a graduate program in public history, completely removed from this narrative now, a supporting character who'd exited the stage. The ceremony lasted 2 hours. Speakers talked about Emily's courage, about the courage of everyone who'd used the tunnel, about the way women had been erased from historical narratives, about the importance of bearing witness to what had been lost. And then it was time for the dedication of the actual memorial. A bronze plaque set into the ground above where Emily had been buried. Emily Marsh, 1843-1883. She came seeking freedom and chose to stay for love. May we remember her name, her choice, and the cost of invisibility. Beneath it were words from the journal she'd left behind. The tunnel was not the destination, he was. And Joshua's photograph, preserved and laminated, hung in a frame inside the information center, not as a couple's portrait because they'd never had one, but as a memorial to the choice Emily had made. In the months that followed, Marcus's life returned to something close to normal. He went back to his job as a contractor. Ironically, he ended up doing some of the restoration work on historical homes in the area, using the skills that the tunnel discovery had forced him to develop. He started dadding again, cautiously and without urgency. He planted a garden in the back of his house, in a section that was far enough from the memorial site to not disturb anything. The excavation had transformed his yard permanently. There was no going back to it being a normal suburban property. But that was okay. It had never been a normal property. It just took the physical presence of history to make that obvious. One day, about 3 years after the discovery, Marcus received an email from a woman named Sarah Harris. She was a descendant of Joshua Harris, living in Toronto. She'd been doing genealogical research and had found something interesting. Joshua Harris had lived to be 87 years old. He'd raised 5 children with his wife, Margaret. He'd been active in his community, respected, remembered. His obituary described him as a man of quiet dignity and strong principles. But Sarah had found his journal, not the one Emily had left behind, but Joshua's own diary. In it, he'd written extensively about Emily, about their time together in the tunnel, about his realization on the journey to Canada that she wasn't coming, about the decision she'd made and his tortured understanding of what it meant. She told me the tunnel was not the destination, that I was. I did not understand then how someone could love someone so much that staying behind to spare them further loss was an expression of that love. I understand now. She ensured I lived free. She paid the price for my freedom. I spend my life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Sarah sent Marcus copies of pages from the diary. She asked if he might be interested in helping with a project, a dual biography of Emily and Joshua, the love story that had survived across more than 150 years of erasure and indifference. He said yes. The book, when it was finally published 3 years later, became a bestseller in ways that neither the research nor the historical significance would have predicted. It told Emily and Joshua's story with unflinching clarity, alongside the story of the tunnel, the story of Marcus's discovery, the story of Patricia's destruction and subsequent attempt at redemption. It became a parable about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore, about the ways that personal ambition could literally bury history, about the long shadow of past choices that extended into the present in ways both unexpected and inevitable. And it was about Marcus, who'd simply dug in his backyard looking for proof that his neighbor was stealing water, and had instead unearthed a 150-year-old love story. On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, Marcus stood at the memorial site with Sarah Harris, who'd become something between a friend and a collaborator through the years of research and writing. "Do you ever regret starting the dig?" she asked. Marcus considered the question seriously. "No, but sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't, if Emily would still be down there, undiscovered, unclaimed, if Joshua's descendants would still have no understanding of where their family story came from." "Patricia would still have her pool," Sarah observed. Yes, Patricia would have her pool and her status and her controlled narrative. And Emily would still be bones in the ground. Marcus nodded. That was the reckoning at the center of everything. Patricia had gained something by covering up the truth, and she'd lost everything in the attempt. Emily had chosen to be buried rather than run, and it had taken over a century for anyone to understand the profundity of that choice. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that Emily would have wanted to be found, would have wanted Joshua to know that she loved him enough to stay behind even if it cost her everything, even if no one ever knew about it." "But knowing matters," Marcus said. Recognition matters. Emily isn't just a skeleton anymore. She's a person with a story, with a choice, with love that sustained her even after death. Sarah smiled. That's what the dig gave her, you gave her that. They stood together, looking at the bronze plaque, at the preservation structure protecting the tunnel entrance, at the information placards explaining the history. All of it existed, because Marcus had been angry enough to dig, persistent enough to keep digging, and brave enough to continue when it became clear that what he'd found was bigger than his argument with Patricia. The Earth, it turned out, was not neutral. The Earth kept secrets, but it also gave them up when pressured enough. And beneath the carefully maintained suburban neighborhoods, the HOA regulations, the pools, and the perfect lawns, lay history that refused to stay buried. Epilogue 5 years later. Patricia Hendricks published her dissertation on cultural preservation and the responsibility of suburban development to historical sites. It was well regarded in academic circles, cited in future preservation debates, taught in university courses. She never returned to Oakmont Estates. She established a nonprofit dedicated to identifying and preserving underground railroad sites in residential areas, ensuring that future development wouldn't destroy what had been left behind. It was good work, meaningful work. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it represented a genuine attempt at redemption, not of her reputation, but of herself. Gregory remarried and moved to California. He made more money and seemed, by all accounts, content in a way he'd never been with Patricia. The Joshua Harris Foundation grew substantially. Dozens of dissertations were written about the couple. Academic conferences featured papers analyzing Emily's choice, Joshua's survival, the tunnel as metaphor and historical fact. And Marcus became a historian without meaning to. The contractor became a researcher, a writer, a voice for the stories that lived beneath the surface of ordinary life. He eventually left his house in Oakmont Estates. It had become too famous, too visited, too much a site of pilgrimage. But before he left, he did something that felt necessary. He took the wedding ring, Emily's wedding ring, and had it carefully preserved in a case. He set it in the memorial center, in a place of honor with a small placard. Worn by Emily Marsh as she chose to stay, worn by love, worn in darkness, worn as an act of devotion that transcended even death. This ring contains the entire story. A woman who refused to run, a man who had to keep going, and the tunnel that became their monument. On the day of the dedication, Marcus stood in front of it and understood finally what Patricia had been unable to comprehend until far too late. That some things, like love, like history, like the weight of the past, couldn't be concreted over, couldn't be ignored, couldn't be controlled. They could only be witnessed, honored, and carried forward into the future, where they would shape everything they touched. The tunnel had been a grave, an escape route, a crime scene, and finally a monument. But underneath all of that, it was simply a place where someone had chosen to be buried rather than leave the person they loved. And that, Marcus thought, was worth digging for.